So I really wanted to focus today on architecture on the king's illness instead of just in inscriptions on an ice house, because I think there's this really interesting interplay between space and sound within these interesting architectural spaces that really draws attention to this kind of critique on class and even this praise of the king and his humanly qualities. So I wanted to dig a little closer into that. So a little background information: the Regency period and its architecture was really focused on the revival of Gothic architecture as well as Byzantine architecture, both of which have their own distinct qualities and have its own respective symbolism. So she actually explicitly mentions it in line 19, where she states, affectionate for thee, the orisons and mingled prayers, alike from vaulted domes, whence the loud organ peals, and raftered roofs of humbler worship. So here we'll first take a look at the vaulted dome. So the dome was an image used an element of architecture used in Byzantine times, in the early Middle Ages, and it mainly was there to create this greater amount of space that allowed for greater acoustic sounds within churches or within religious temples. And this was to kind of illustrate or emulate this idea of transcending earthliness and being closer to God through space, through air. So it's very interesting that she uses that image, especially in the 1800s, because later on the dome isn't necessarily used for preserving Byzantine culture. It is more so used as its own symbolism, which is to kind of transcend earthly realm. So she also uses the idea of, she says vaulted domes, but the vault was an interesting element in Gothic architecture, in which the stone vault replaced the previous Romanesque structure and really was there to amplify and take use of more space upwards instead of greater horizontally, in order to bridge this gap between the earthly realm and the heavenly realm. It was mainly used in churches so that the worship would feel closer with God. So this image is really fascinating because it's really interested in using space as this kind of bridge between earthly and heavenly, and it almost kind of disrupts this idea of hierarchy. So she uses sound within these large open spaces, like the mingled prayers, which, as she mentioned earlier, is of the humans and the kings. So there's this idea of this breaking down of class, which is really fascinating. And then she states the loud organ peals, which is another, instrument that creates this beautiful symphonic sound, which is meant to kind of transcend this realm, and almost in this really interesting way of creating more of a unified notion of togetherness. So another interesting aspect of Gothic architecture is that it was meant to kind of draw more attention to the humanism of church figures such as Mary and Jesus. It became more fascinated with the idea of portraying Jesus on the cross and as human rather than as this deity, as this huge God. So she definitely playing with this idea of humanness within these wide open spaces, these really interesting, almost in between heaven and in between earthly stage, in which, in her mind, the king portrays, because he is, he's suffering, and she notices this, but he's also kind of not necessarily completely a royal in his personality, because he still is so connected to the lower class. So this is this really interesting imagery that she uses with architecture to draw closer attention and kind of just nuance her argument on her sympathy for the king and his illness, and it demonstrates this idea of breaking down class barriers and just focusing on togetherness.